fears, failures. Fill my life again. I give my life to follow everything I believe in. Now I surrender all to you. Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Oh, shine your light and let the whole world sing. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Jesus, shine your light and let the whole world sing. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Shine your light and let the whole world sing. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Jesus, shine your light and let the whole world sing. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Savior, He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave.
Is the gospel losing its power to change lives? That was the paper that I gave. It was in a large kind of a hotel boardroom. We were all sitting around a table. There might have been 40 or so when you counted everybody. And these are some of the thoughts that I shared. My own convictions about something I see happening. By the way, I have 3 points. I'm going to do 2 of them this morning and finish 1 of them tonight. Most of the work with the text will be tonight in the last point, which is different from the way I would normally do it. Normally, of course, I would start with the text and we'd be working with that. I wanted to share some thoughts up front and tonight wrap up with what I think the New Testament diagnosis and solution is. So my convictions about, and they're just my convictions, but I think I've been around now long enough, and the advantage perhaps of staying in one place for 26 years or so is you get to see things coming and going and ebbing and flowing in a way you might not if you were just here for 2 years, there for 1 year, there for 3 years. You start to see the trends and you start to see things forming and developing more gradually, and you can observe them in a way you couldn't if you were a little bit more transient in the nature of your ministry. So my convictions about what I see happening in our churches in Canada, and I include PAOC churches, and I said that in Germany, and more importantly, why I think it's happening. I think why it may be happening relates to how all of us sort of frame up our understanding about what ministry ought to be like, what we all ought to be doing as disciples and followers of Jesus, as pastors and missionaries and lay people, because we all serve Christ in our own capacity. It came to a head for me a little bit this past summer. We had gone to Minneapolis. Renee and I from the east and her family from the west, mostly in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and Minneapolis is kind of a convenient halfway point. So typically in the summer we drive, we meet there, we spend a week or so, and we golf and we just visit, and it's a good time. The main reason for the trip, as any thinking person should realize, was to attend the PGA at Hazeltine and see Tiger Woods defeated. It was a glorious occasion. And then we were off to John Piper's church for Sunday. Great service, great message, and I made my regular dash, everybody waiting for me in the van, and I made my regular dash to the bookstore, just wanting to look through and see what was available in there right after the benediction. And it was there that something kind of disturbing happened inside my head. I was reading some articles. This wasn't a book. I have a collection of some articles and talks, and I read a quote that passed in front of my eyes like all words do when you read them, but the effect that the words had on my mind really stayed with me. All I can say is it felt like somebody hit me with a blunt lead pipe on the back of the head, and it just really made a dent in my cranium. It wasn't that the idea was so new or so innovative or I had never thought about it before. It was just more the way the words were arranged that made it like I'd never quite thought it through in the way I should have. And this isn't a direct quote, but it was something like this. Only in a climate where sin is labeled and exposed can the gospel have any power or even the most remote trace of relevance. And I guess it was the way my mind sounded out that word, any. Only in a climate where sin is exposed can the gospel have any power, or even the most remote relevance. And I thought, really? So the gospel can become totally irrelevant? Totally powerless? This gospel totally useless? It just didn't sound right, and I couldn't get that disturbed feeling out of my stomach. It just seemed to me that the author was saying, we're not just dealing with style of ministry here, like some people like contemporary and some people like traditional. And we're not just dealing with degrees of fidelity to the truth. Like, aren't there some points of doctrine that aren't worth quibbling about? And we weren't just talking about degrees of effectiveness, like the gospel works better under these conditions than those conditions. You know, the way some plants do better in sun and some plants do better in shade. No, the writer seemed to be saying, if you don't get this right, this is kind of ground zero. And if you don't get this principle right, whatever else you may be doing, you're not working with the Christian gospel anymore at all. Now back to what I said at the beginning about something I see happening in the church, and then later on why I think it's happening. Point number one. I don't think it's deniable anymore. We seem to have so many misfires in professing converts to Christianity. We can't just whistle and pretend it isn't happening. There's a large portion of a whole generation that is becoming Christian in heritage only. There are more and more professions of faith that leave the life totally unchanged from what it was before the profession of faith. Now, don't misunderstand me. I know Christians have never been anything more than a pale reflection of the beauty and power of Jesus Christ. It's always been that way. We've always needed a humble reliance on God's grace for any measure of conformity to Christ. And we fail and we stumble and we come to Jesus. That's not news to anybody that we're not perfect. I'm not talking about that. Now it's different. I talk to people all the time in this church. And it's precisely that so many no longer sense their failure to follow Jesus as closely as they should. They justify what we used to call worldliness by saying, you don't understand. I do believe in Jesus, just not the same as you believe in Jesus. I have my own relationship with Jesus. It's my personal relationship with Jesus. And every time you hear that, you need to understand what's being said. It's a phrase that's nowhere used in the New Testament. It's not a bad phrase. What it used to mean was this. It used to mean Don Horban's not a Christian because Michael and Daisy Horban were Christians. The phrase personal relationship with Jesus used to mean you don't inherit this. You don't get it by going to church. It's an individual commitment to Christ that you must make for yourself, which is why we do believers' baptism and we don't sprinkle infants. Believers' baptism is meant to show discontinuity with the Old Testament covenantal system, not continuity. But now, personal relationship with Jesus has come to mean something else. What it means is, no, I have my own relationship with Jesus, and it's personal. Don't you go telling me how to live, and what I have to think, and what I have to believe. It's my personal relationship. Jesus and I just kind of hug each other. And so they say it's not like your relationship with Jesus. That's a different time, a different era, a different view of the Bible, a different view of worldliness, a different view of truth. I have my own personal one, and it's different. And different, of course, is an understatement. I got a long quote. I wouldn't have done this had I been preparing a sermon at the time, but remember, it wasn't in a sermon context. Can you handle it? Can you just sit and think with me for a minute? Consider these words by George Barna in his book and video, Morality in the Church. He's kind of, in my opinion, gone off the rails a bit recently, but this was still when he was writing in a more reliable, I think, style. He says this. Now, this is an American, talking about an American survey, but I don't think it's all that terribly different. Americans unanimously denounced the September 11 terrorist attacks as a textbook example of evil, suggesting that there is a foundational belief in an absolute standard of right and wrong. Subsequent research, however, has shown that in the aftermath of the attacks, only a minority of Americans believe in the existence of absolute moral truth. Even more surprising, the data from a pair of nationwide studies conducted by Barna Research Group of Ventura, California, showed that less than 1 out of 3 born-again Christians, these are people calling themselves Christians, whether they are or not, that's up to God, but people who classify themselves as born-again Christians, less than 1 out of 3 born-again Christians adopt the notion of absolute moral truth. The surveys also found that few Americans turn to their faith as the primary guide for their moral and ethical decisions. In 2 national surveys conducted by Barna Research, one among adults and one among teenagers, Christians were asked if they believe that there are moral absolutes that are unchanging or that moral truth is relative to the circumstances. By a 3-to-1 margin, that's 64% versus 22%, adults said truth is always relative to the person and their situation. The perspective was even more lopsided among teenagers. These are professing Christian teenagers. 83% of whom said moral truth depends on the circumstances, and only 6% of whom said moral truth is absolute. If that's the case, we've lost the day. It's all over. Because if that's the truth, you can hammer people over the head with this as long as you want. They're going to say, well, that's nice that that's true for you. I'm glad you're happy with it. Cute little you with your Bible. Enjoy. In addition, Barna research noted that substantial numbers of Christians believe that activities such as abortion, gay sex, cohabitation, drunkenness, viewing pornography are morally acceptable in certain situations. Barna states, quote, without some firm and compelling basis for suggesting that such acts are sinful, people are left with philosophies such as, if it feels good, do it, everyone else is doing it, or, more commonly, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else, it's permissible. In fact, the alarmingly fast decline of moral foundations among Christians has culminated in a one-word worldview, whatever. How often have you heard that? The result is a mentality, and here's where I'm going with all this, a mentality that esteems pluralism, relativism, tolerance, and diversity without critical reflection on the implications of particular views or actions. I'm almost done. Just 1 out of 10 of our country's born-again teenagers believe in absolute moral truth. A statistic that is nearly identical to that of non-Christian teens. Where they got that, by the way, by and large, is the media. The generation under 30 is owned by the media. They may turn to their Bibles, but they're owned by Hollywood, the media, and the music industry. Christian families, educators, and churches must prioritize this matter if the Christian community hopes to have any distinctiveness in our culture. The virtual disappearance of this cornerstone of the Christian faith, that is, that God has communicated a series of moral principles in the Bible that are meant to be the basis of our thoughts and actions, regardless of our preferences, feelings, or situations. The disappearance of that view is probably the best indicator of the waning strength of the Christian church today. And the failure to address this issue at its root, and to do so quickly, will undermine the strength of the church for at least another full generation and probably longer. I don't have time to take that much further. But the problem is not that these Christians Barna describes are weighed down by guilt and sin. That would be good news if that were the case. The problem is we have more and more professing Christians who don't read or know their Bibles, who don't go to church very much anymore because churches offer less and less services and because they find it boring, and I want to talk about that in a minute. People who sleep with whomever they please, married or single, and when they do come to church, they come with hands lifted and eyes closed and tears streaming down their face, singing about how much they love and adore and worship Jesus. That's the problem. Somehow they're not getting it. It's not that they feel they're failures as Christians. It's that they have redefined discipleship on their own terms. That's what's happening. It's happening to a whole generation. That last sentence in Barna's quote, it seems so important, at least in his mind, the failure to address this issue at its root and to do so quickly will undermine the strength of the church for at least another full generation and probably longer. It seems so important to Barna that it makes me wish he were a bit more informative. I mean, the sentence doesn't, except maybe in very general terms, it doesn't make clear exactly how we must address this issue. And that's what I was sharing in Germany. The failure to address this issue at its root. Well, how will we do that? What is to be done? If it's true, and I'm arguing that it is true, that growing numbers of Christians see no need to live like Christians if all of those "what would Jesus do" bracelets aren't promoting lifestyles of holiness and self-denial, then what are we to do? And here's my point. I'm arguing that quote that I read that dented the back of my mind in Minneapolis, only in a climate where sin is labeled and exposed can the gospel have any power or even the most remote trace of relevance. And when I shared that in Germany, at least two, one clearly and one more guardedly, but at least two people made it quite clear that it's not our job to tell people they're sinners. And I wasn't sure what to say. Now, obviously, if you mean by that, we don't run up with them with a club, beat them over the head. You good-for-nothing, lousy sinner. Okay, fine. So you use your head. But what do we tell people about Jesus? If not that he came to redeem us from our sin. How is Jesus different from Gandhi? Point number 2. And now as I'm sharing this, you can see sweat, on my forehead. At least in Canada, we pastors and leaders bear a big part of the blame for the disappearance of that climate described in that article where sin is labeled and exposed. I don't think we did it on purpose. It didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually. I think we had the best of intentions. I think several things combined, at least in the North American context, and remember now I'm speaking to missionaries from all over the world. Some things combined in our North American culture that made it feel narrow-minded, prudish, heaven forbid, perhaps even intolerant to harp on sin and God's wrath and judgment and eternity. A couple of things combined to do that, and these again, this is my opinion. 3 things. First, and I'm not a critic of this, I'm a participant in this. With all of the wonderful things resulting from the renewal in worship music in the last 25 years, there has been something dangerous embedded in it. And we talk about this in our church. And I said to the people around the table, and I would say it to you right now, I don't know how many worship choruses you know, but probably if you really wrote down all of them, maybe 100. Quickly as you can, list 3, just 3 contemporary worship songs with the word judgment in them. Anybody getting anything? Quick as you can, list 2, just 2, with the word wrath in them. I got one, and I love it. It's kind of like a hymn, but I think it's fairly new, and I wish I could see Tom's face because I could use his help. What's the one where the guy writes, da 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 da? Remember? Before the throne of God above, and he talks about the wrath of God is satisfied. And every time I sing it, I just want to scream, God bless you. Anybody think of any other one? I'm not talking about an old hymn. I'm talking about a contemporary chorus. Because I got nothing. Is that a worship course? And it has wrath in it? So we got 2 now. Attaboy, Bob. Just for that, you can sell my house next time when I need somebody to... See, now you wish you'd spoken up. Don't miss my point. I know that at least most of us still believe in those things. That's not my issue at all. Though even that is getting debatable. My issue right now isn't that I don't think we believe in those concepts. My question is different. My question is this: what happens in the minds and hearts of Christians, even those who have a doctrinal agreement with the wrath of God against sin and the inevitability of judgment when the wrath of God against sin is revealed, when people unrepentantly resist God's ways? What happens to the lifestyle of a whole generation of Christians who grow up never hearing about judgment, sin, and wrath? What happens to the lifestyle of Christians who never hear about those things? Remember the quote, only in a climate where sin is labeled and exposed can the gospel have any power or even the most remote trace of relevance. And I'm arguing that when people never have those concepts reinforced in their corporate worship and music is the actual theology of the people of God when they gather together. What they sing. When people never have those concepts reinforced in their corporate worship, the power, not the belief, the power of those concepts will wear very thin over 1 or 2 generations. And when you start to talk about judgment and wrath, and I experienced it over there, it just suddenly the words feel out of place now. And I'm thinking, when did this happen? Who did this while we weren't looking? So one of the things that's brought pressure to bear on pastors and leaders is, in the disappearance of this climate where sin is labeled and exposed, is the theological vacuum that gets created by a burgeoning worship industry. I said there were 3 things that contributed to this situation. The second thing is, as the church has become less doctrinal and increasingly therapeutic, talk about sin and wrath and judgment has seemed increasingly out of place. And that puts immense pressure on leaders because, after all, who wants to look out of place? Add to that the list of books on effective church growth and leadership that tell me that if people don't embrace what we teach and what we do, if the culture doesn't instantly just like everything about the church, then we're doing something wrong. And that will not bear the weight of New Testament study. The fact that people all around this church don't like what this church stands for is no indication that this church isn't doing it right. It's more an indication of a fact that the God of this age has blinded the minds of people to see the glory of God. But we've got a whole church that's coming up thinking, you know what, if people don't think we're just the coolest, slickest, neatest, caffeine-drinking, wonderful place on the planet, then we're not seeker-sensitive. Acceptance by our culture has come to equal success in message and ministry in a lot of churches. That's a huge mistake. I'm not saying, we need to be as seeker-insensitive as we can be. That's not my point. This is the pot in which many of us serve Christ. Most of the bestsellers deny, downplay, or totally ignore the consistent teaching of the Scriptures on God's wrath and judgment against human sin. Just consider the whopping bestseller, The Shack. Just as one example among many. If you loved it, God bless you. One day you'll get to heaven and realize, what was I thinking? Quote, I don't need to punish people for sin. Sin is its own punishment. That's page 118. And these words pour out of the mouth of none other than Papa God himself or herself, portrayed as an apron-clad Aunt Jemima. I don't need to punish people for sin. Sin is its own punishment. Now, of course, the book is just a novel or an allegory, but once you start putting words into God's mouth, people, or at least Christian people, should be very careful about what he's made to say. And other places in the same book virtually eliminate the reality of any future eternal judgment against sin. Sin is its own judgment, God says. I don't need to punish people for sin. But doesn't God judge sin? What about Achan and his entire family? You remember when he stole that gold? We went through the book of Joshua and studied it at length. And he takes it and he hides it under his tent. And do you remember they start suffering defeat in battle? God says to Joshua, and they take it tribe by clan by family, and in the greatest sifting process in history, it comes right down to Achan, and he sins. And a couple things could have happened. God could have, he did it with the sons of Korah, just make the earth open up and swallow Achan up and judge him. Only God doesn't do that. He could have had Joshua and the soldiers take him out and execute him, and God doesn't do that. Remember what God does? Anybody remember that story? I can see why you might want to blank it out of your mind. It's one of the most troubling stories in the whole Old Testament. And God gets the children of Israel, and God speaks to Joshua, and he says, you get the people. Not you, Joshua. I don't want you doing it. You get the people. And you bring Achan out. And you get his wife. And you get his kids. I don't know, did he have 4-year-old children? Get his family, and you get all of his livestock. And then you get the people, just the ordinary people of Israel, and you get them all around him with rocks. And you make the people stone Achan and his family and his livestock. Now you're at the front of the road. Just picture it. There you are. Standing right there. There's the rock. You start. And I'm sure most of us, if we could have had a knowledge, we would have said, oh, no, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Only God says, no, you. Throw it. Now. How do you feel? And then when they're all stoned, God says, now you burn what's left. Read it sometime this afternoon. God doesn't judge sin. What about Sodom and Gomorrah? What about Lot's wife, turned to a pillar of salt, just because she turns around and looks back? Not totally. You can understand why she might have. What about Jesus on the cross? Why is he dying there anyway? If sin brings its own punishment, why can't God just let sin play itself out in our lives, bring its own punishment in our 70 years, and then we'll all just be happy for eternity? Why can't he do that? Why does Jesus have to die? Why is he crucified precisely at the celebration of Passover. And the hours between when he's put on the cross and when he says it is finished coincide just perfectly with the hours of Passover. Is that coincidence? Or are we supposed to think of the children of Israel, and there they are in Egypt, and this is where Passover came from? And God says, you kill the lamb and take the blood and put it over the doorposts of the house because I'm coming. And whoever isn't protected by that blood, I, not Satan, I will strike the firstborn dead. Is that what we're supposed to be thinking about when we hold that little glass of grape juice in our hands? We used to sing it. It wasn't a great song, but at least it had this much in it. We used to sing, when I see the blood, remember? I will pass over you. What's Jesus doing here? Is it just, he just loves us? Well, yeah, but that's not nearly enough. It's the wrath of God. That's why he's there. And what about the rest of the New Testament? What about Ananias and Sapphira? What about the many, Paul says, God has judged with sickness and death because their wicked hearts at the Lord's table? And what about the revelation of a future event? Apparently a revelation from Jesus himself to John on the island of Patmos, where Jesus says, and if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. I can't think of the last time I was anywhere in any church and heard anyone talk about the lake of fire. We just love Jesus, don't we? Said there were three things: the nature of the worship industry, the therapeutic nature of the church, and thirdly, I think people tend to assess our deepest needs without calculating the reality of the fall. I think this is so common. It came home afresh to me while I was watching Larry King one night. And Larry King was interviewing Joel Osteen. And you could just sense where this was going before it ever got there. And as soon as Osteen mentioned how wonderful and helpful Jesus Christ was to people, and I think he meant that just sincerely from the bottom of his heart, but how wonderful and helpful Jesus Christ was to people, Larry jumped all over that open door and asked the question you could see coming a mile away. Well, what about people who don't know anything about Jesus Christ? You aren't saying they're all doomed, are you? And you could see the panic over Osteen's face. I mean, you can't appear intolerant of other religions on network television. Larry King did the smart thing. He just went straight for the jugular issue. Jesus wouldn't be intolerant of other sincerely practiced religions, good people, would he? And Joel took the only road he had open. He said, Larry, my dad worked with Hindus in India for years, and those were some of the dearest people he ever met. I was scribbling this down. I know this is basically what was said. And I don't know how to answer your question for sure, but I know in my heart that God will judge those people by their hearts. Maybe they never heard of Jesus, but they have good hearts. And God will judge them not by their religion, but by what's in their hearts. Larry King seemed happy with the response. But it's full of problems. Enormous ones. Let me ask you something. Let's just play Let's Pretend just for a second. If Jesus came back right now, aren't you glad you're in church? And there you stand before the great white throne. Let's pretend that books are opened and some angel or some right-hand person comes and says, now we've changed things just a bit. You can either be judged by your deeds or If you prefer, we'll judge you by everything that's in your heart. Which would you choose? And I can answer that in a heartbeat. Deeds. Please, judge me by my deeds. Wouldn't you? I mean, I go to church a lot. Sure, I get paid. I've never cheated on my wife, ever. I'm not addicted to drugs or alcohol. I don't swear. I give to my church. I give to other charities. I have several Child Care Plus children. I try not to lie. I love my wife. I read my Bible. I've never been in jail. I've never been in trouble with the law. I haven't had a speeding ticket in 20 years. It's not bad. Oh, but please don't start looking in my heart. I'm doomed if you start looking in my heart. Do I really want to stand accountable for every single second that I didn't love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength? It hurts me right now just to think of that. What about every time I coveted material things? My new $22 Rolex. What about every moment of silent pride? What about every time I knew something good to do and I didn't get to doing it? Because James says that's sin. Anybody ever committed that one? What about every moment of anger? Even if I was mature enough and wise enough not to express it in a burst of temper and rage, in mean and nasty, hasty words. That's good that I didn't. But remember, not expressing my anger is wisdom, but it's not righteousness. I mean, not expressing my anger doesn't erase the wickedness of that anger in my heart. Silence can't erase that anger. Only the blood of Jesus can erase that anger. So what could Larry and Joel have been thinking? Who could possibly take any comfort whatsoever from the fact that God will judge us by what's in our hearts? I'll tell you who. Only those who talk about people's hearts as though the fall never happened. Only those who don't reckon regularly with the blunt reality of inward corruption and sin. There's none righteous. No, not one. All our righteousness, and our righteousness, by the way, that's the best things we do. It's like filthy rags. Churches have gotten caught up in the same optimistic view of who we are as people, and consequently are losing sight of what the gospel is really for. Bright-sounding euphemisms for conversion abound. It's become your spiritual journey. That's just a horrible... If there's an overworked word that ought to be banned from religious talk, it's this journey. You're on your journey, I'm on my journey. So after all, who's to tell you you're going in the wrong direction? It's your journey. I'm on my journey. Or worse, a personal, life-transforming experience. Or worse still, people realizing their full potential as beings created in the image of God. Now, none of those phrases is sinful in itself, but none says anything about sin, redemption, what needs to be done about sin. None of them calls to mind a gospel that emphasizes justification by faith or a substitutionary atonement or anything in the realm of accountability beyond this earthly life. They're more about therapy than they are about atonement. And once that climate pervades, then the gospel is a useless bit of information. And so the inevitable result of all this is people are getting bored with church. Church has become just a plural for Christian. So 3 Christians at Starbucks is church. But it's not. It's not. It's not a coincidence that we've come to a time when many prefer to think of, a group of 4 Christians at Starbucks as church rather than the First Presbyterian Church on Main Street. Once doctrine and sin and redemption and eternity, once those things recede in emphasis, the church just becomes one more of many options for making a positive difference in this world. And so naturally, people can pick and choose whatever they might want to get involved in. Now try to remember where we've been. I know this has been a little bit different. First, there was that haunting quote. Only in a climate where sin is labeled and exposed can the gospel have any power or even the most remote trace of relevance. Then, in pondering the relevance of the gospel, I've been laboring over 2 ideas this morning. First, we seem to have so many misfires in conversions to Christ. And second, I think we pastors and leaders bear some of the blame for the de-emphasizing of that climate where sin is recognized. And then we looked at 3 ways in which that climate was eroded. First, the nature of at least much of the current worship material. Second, the trend in the Christian mass market and popular bestsellers. And third, the ease with which therapeutic religion can aim its material at people not taking into account the fall and the radical nature of sin in our beings.